to tell you today we're going to talk about trust. Relational trust, not trust between you and God, but trust between your family, your coworkers, friends. I want to talk about trust because it's very, very, very misunderstood. You know, some of you are going, okay, Pastor Charity, if I could crawl back further in my chair, this isn't something I want to talk about. I'm good just how I am. Well, that's my job. My job is to poke and prod and make you a little uncomfortable. I'm okay with making you squirm in your chair. 1 Corinthians. Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, and in it, he wrote these 4 little phrases that tell us how extremely important the value of trust is. That your relationships, whether at home, at work, do you realize they're no stronger than the amount of trust that you place in that person? Trust is the foundation of all of our relationships. If you can't trust, if you don't know how to trust, if you're not willing to take a risk when it comes to trust, you're never going to be able to fully engage relationally with other people. And there's 2 things that make it hard for us as humans to trust. They're what you see and who you are. Somebody said they were going to do something and they didn't do it. You experience that they didn't follow through. They didn't keep their promise. When I see that, it makes it hard for me to trust them. The other thing is who you are. You all grew up in some kind of home. You had a bad experience with an ex-husband or ex-wife. An in-law who feels like an outlaw. A former occupation that just went bad. A company that you're like, they were just the worst to work for. Through all those experiences, something happens in your heart and you start learning not to trust. So it's going to make this app seem a little harder to put into practice and apply it. But as Christians, we're instructed, when we get to 1 Corinthians here, we're going to have to bend. We're going to have to stretch. We're going to have to learn to trust. So 1 Corinthians 13. Paul doesn't just give a sentence on what he wants you to know about. He gives you this description. I'm teaching Thomas and language art right now, and we're doing adverbs and adjectives. There's those things that make it go from the dog slept to the lazy dog was taking a long nap on the brown carpet. Well, that's a whole lot more interesting to listen to than the dog slept. Those words that add insight to let us know. So Paul, instead of just writing, you should love, he writes what it means, how it looks like. And as he's talking about love, he runs into this very interesting word, the issue of trust. And I'm sure when he was writing this, he got there and he said, how do I do this? How do I explain this? Because when I say it, people aren't going to like it. They're not going to like that I'm poking at them and telling them, this is what you need to do. They're going to think this sounds way too extreme to put in the Bible and say, this is what you should do. But 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 and 5. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrong. Now hold up. I want you to stop right there. I like that last part. You're married to somebody. You've got a relationship with somebody who's got that imaginary filing cabinet, right? Right. That at any given moment they can go, oh, look, yeah, see, 1985, July 2nd, 9:04 p.m., yes, you said you were going to do this, and look, You didn't do it. And here it is again, and you didn't do it again. Love doesn't have a filing cabinet, guys. I know it's a hard thing for us to understand. It keeps no record of wrong. Verse 6 goes on to say, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in truth. Now, I'm not talking about a specific evil here. I'm talking about it in general. So you know what that means? That means it's not trying to catch you doing it wrong. It's not standing there going, aha, I caught you, you did it wrong again. I'm going to write that down on my note card. You did it wrong again. See, I knew it. I knew if I just asked you to do it, I knew you weren't going to follow through. That's not how it works. You know what Paul says in 1 Corinthians? What love's looking to do? The opportunity to catch you doing it right. Amen. And Paul, so he said these things and he goes, you ever sitting there and you're working on something and you're looking at it, it's just not quite right. So Paul goes on and he makes 4 short little statements about what love does. It always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. Always? Really? That seems awfully extreme. I bet when Paul wrote that, he was thinking, God, you gave me the words, and I'm writing what you said to write, but always? No exceptions? No exceptions. Always. Love bends. Love leans into. It's always looking for the opportunity to give the other person the benefit of the doubt. It's protecting that relationship by saying, okay, let me work on it. I trust you. And yeah, that puts a big burden on you because that means it's a lot of work. It means the first time they screw up, you don't get to snap. The New American Standard Version says this of verse 7. It bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things. There's not a limitation there. There's not a caveat that says, well, these circumstances it's okay not to. Always. It trusts. So I've got some thoughts here on that. Love always gives the other person the benefit of the doubt. Love, when there's a discrepancy between what's promised and what actually happens, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. It looks for the most generous explanation of somebody else's behavior. Between what was promised and what actually occurred. And you can sit here and go, yeah, my kids, I asked this and they did that. My boss said this and he did this. You know, love says, you know what, before I jump to conclusions, is there another possibility? It looks for a generous explanation. Love chooses trust over suspicion. In every relationship, there's expectations, whether it's at home or at work, your neighborhood, you're the coach of the Little League team, you're in a club. There's always expectations about what we're supposed to do, what we think is going to happen. And then there's what actually occurs. That's our experience. So, you said you'd come home at this time. You got home at a different time. You said we were going to work on this project together, and then you took all my ideas and made them your own. Sometimes there's a gap between what we expected and what we experience. If you get nothing else out of what I say today, I want you to listen to this next thing. When there's this gap, you choose what goes in the middle. You're sitting there thinking, no, Pastor Charity. I didn't choose. They said they were going to do this. They did that. They filled the middle. They caused the gap, and they put it in the middle. They forced me to assume the worst. Guess what? When it comes to the foundation of a great relationship, love's going to bend. It's going to do everything it can to protect that relationship. Because love understands that you and I choose what goes in that gap. Not the other person. You choose. You choose what goes in the gap. And guess what, guys? There's gaps at every level of every relationship. You're raising kids, you've told them 100 times, clean your room. And they don't clean it. There's a gap. You sit down as a family and you and your husband, you set a budget. And you get the Visa bill the next month and you realize they went on a shopping spree. It was not in the budget. There's a gap. You go to work and you're supposed to do this presentation. And you show up on the day and the other person didn't pull their weight. There's a gap. In every relationship, there's a gap between what we expect and what we experience. We choose what goes in that gap. Paul says love is always looking for the opportunity to believe the best rather than to assume the worst. Research is showing that the best relationships and the best marriages work when both parties go to ridiculous extremes to believe the best in the other person. It's essentially saying love is blind. I care so much about you that yes, you came home late again, but instead of sitting here and being angry, let's talk. I'm going to believe the best of you. Love always believes, it always trusts. Did you know there's nothing to be gained by you refusing to trust someone else? Think about it. Think in every relationship where you're like, well, I don't trust that person. It damages you. There's not really anything to be gained by not trusting. When we don't trust, we get suspicious. And suspicion is an expression of rejection. When you feel like, I don't trust you. When somebody else is suspicious of everything you do. They look at you and they wonder, well, why did you text them and not me? Why did you go talk to that person first and not come see me? Why didn't you tell me about that? Everybody else knows. Why don't I know? You start the why? And do you know what happens in a relationship when we feel rejected? We close down. We shut ourselves out from that person. Did you know God designed you to be an acceptance magnet? We're drawn to situations that we feel accepted, right? You don't want to go hang out with the group that, like, when you walk up, turns their back and, that's not what you want. You want to hang out with the people who, when they see you coming across the room, open up that circle and go, yeah, come join us. We're so excited you're here. Well, that's how God built us. He built you to be like a magnet. We're drawn to places we're accepted and to people. So when you choose to assume the worst, even if you're right, did you hear that part? Even if you're right about what they were doing and it was wrong, but when you choose to assume the worst first, you've taken a step towards closing down that relationship. You're no longer protecting it at all costs. You're no longer enduring. You're no longer bending like love bends. It's a powerful thing to look at somebody and say, I trust you. It's a whole lot better than looking and going, na, you screwed up again. Yep, I just knew it. Right here on my list, I just knew you were going to do it again.
Come on, Pastor.
Wouldn't you rather I walked up and I went, you messed up, but I still love you. And you're all thinking in your head, well, that sounds really good, Pastor Charity. That's a nice thing. But you don't know.
You were it there.
My ex-husband. You don't know my boss. You don't know. Guess what? There aren't any exceptions. I asked. I looked at it. It says always. Always doesn't have an exception button. There's no safety hatch here. It's always. I'm telling you this, no matter how bad your situation, no matter how wide the gap, no matter how consistently there is a gap with that person, nobody's ever forced you to assume the worst. Nobody can do that. That's within your power. You choose what goes in that gap. The best chance to restore and to heal relationships is to believe the best in the other person. And Paul says, I get it, this sounds extreme. It doesn't sound practical. Like in every relationship, really? Not like 98% of the time. I don't get like a get out of jail free card. Like I went all the way around the board and I landed on the chance card and I got the get out of jail. No, sorry. Do everything in your power to communicate, I trust you. Now, here's my caveat to this. What happens when you can't? I got an answer. The gap gets wider and wider, and you're like, I don't know what to do. I'm doing everything. I'm bending. I'm gonna fall over in a second. I'm bending so far. Well, guess what? When you can't choose to trust, I want you to confront. There's an interesting thought. When you can't choose to trust, I want you to confront. Jesus mentioned it in the Bible, and he told us how to do it. And you got to go to that person. And here's the problem that we have. We don't, as a society, we don't confront. We gossip. Did you know what she said about me? I heard it the other day. I was walking by in the coffee room, and she was just talking. We don't go talk about what she said to her. We stand over here. We don't talk to, we talk about. We post it on Facebook. We text it to 50 other people. I am so angry that she did, No. We have imaginary conversations. Some of you are like, I don't do any of that. I guarantee you have the imaginary conversation. You are sitting there in your head, whether it can be your kids, and you're just like, I told them to be home, and they're not home, and I'm going to wring their little necks when they get here, and I'm sure that they've been out doing this and this and this, or you're sitting there and you're like, he's late again. He's not here. Don't know what he's doing, who he's out with, But then the funny thing about human nature is they walk in the door, and then you're all happy. Oh, you're home. Let's have dinner. What you start to notice is all of a sudden that same person will look at you later and go, what's wrong? Nothing.
Right.
What's wrong? Nothing. I'm fine. Nothing. But the problem with this is, the reason they're asking is because did you know when you're suspicious, it sends out a signal? Like, I just can't trust you. I don't know what it is. The problem with the not confronting is, eventually, you're going to snap. And when you do, it's like Mount St. Helens, and everybody better duck and cover. Amen. So, when there's a gap, I want you to have a conversation. A confrontation. You're asking for an explanation. That's what this confrontation is. It's not you standing there yelling at the other person. This is important. It's very cool. It's very calm. This isn't done in anger. This is just simply standing there and saying, I'm asking for an explanation, and I'm assuming there's a good one. Yeah. I'm not asking because I don't trust you. I'm asking because I am assuming the best of you. Yeah. I'm not going to make up a story in my mind explaining why all this has gone on or why it hasn't happened. I'm just going to assume the best and wait to hear it from you. Some of you may be like, I don't want to confront somebody. Like I said, I'm not asking you to stand there and jump in their face and get down their throat. All of us have somebody in our world who's a confronter who just wants to pick a fight because they want to pick a fight. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm asking you to say is, when there's a gap, have the conversation. Isn't it true, most of the time, when you actually get up the courage to go talk to somebody and you get the explanation, most of the time you'll walk away going, oh, well, that makes sense. That wasn't all the crazy things I'd concocted in my head. I didn't know there was something else going on. I didn't realize that I had done something else in the relationship. Well, in every relationship, there's expectations. Something does or doesn't happen. And every time there's that gap, we choose what goes inside. So Paul simply says, to the uttermost bend, believe the best. When it's too hard to give a generous explanation, you ask. You ask quickly. You don't sit there and stew in it for a month. You ask them, you go to them directly. Pastor Andy Stanley, I like him. Really smart guy. He pastors a church called North Point Church. And his staff gets together once a year, and at their retreat, they all stand up and they take this 5-point pledge. And the 5-point pledge is simply this. It has to do with gaps. The first thing that they do is, when there's a gap between what I expected and what I experienced, I'm going to believe the best. They pledge that's what they're going to do. I'm going to decide ahead of time, before there's the gap that exists, that I'm going to give a generous explanation for your behavior, and then I'm going to talk to you about it. The second thing is, when other people assume the worst about you, I'm going to come to your defense. When you see a gap with somebody else, it's our job to go and say, you know what, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's get a real explanation. That you make a promise in your relationships that I'm going to promise ahead of time. Until the facts say otherwise, I'm going to come to your defense. The third one is, if what I experience begins to erode my trust, I'll come directly to you. So it's not saying I'm going to wait for you and stand over here and go, yep, there's a gap here between me and you. You created it. You have to come to me. No. Part of that love giving and that trust building is saying, you know what? There's a gap. And I've seen it. And instead of letting it get bigger, you know what? I'm going to step over that gap and stand here and say, we got a gap. And we got to figure this out. It's not always waiting for the other person to come to you. The fourth one. When I'm convinced I will be unable to deliver on a promise, I'm going to tell you ahead of time. So some of these things fall back on us. If I told you I was going to show up and I was going to help, and all of a sudden I realize I am running so far behind, or 3 other things came up, and I'm just not going to be able to. I'm not going to let you sit at the coffee shop and wait for 3 hours while I don't show up. I'm going to take it upon myself and say, you know what? Before that gap is created, I can stop it by saying, you know what? I messed up. I can't follow through. I can't be there to help. I'm going to be late. Whatever it is, you have the power to stop it before it starts. Just by having a conversation. And the fifth one, this is a big one. When you confront me about the gaps I created, I'm going to tell you the truth. So when you get confronted, when somebody comes and says, there's a gap here, you've broken down my trust barrier with you, I'm going to trust you enough to say, this is what's going on. This is what happened. I don't want there to be a gap. It doesn't all fall on the other person. But you got to commit to when somebody brings the gap to you, you go, man, you're right. I want to fix this. Most people want to be trusted. I know very few people who would stand up and say, I would like to be an untrustworthy person. Right? When you look at somebody and say, I want to trust you, the average person thinks, I want to be worthy of that trust. I want to be worthy of that trust. Sometimes it's having the conversation to say, what can I do so that I can trust you? I'm telling you, even in the worst situations, the worst relationships you've got, if you're willing to look at that other person and say, I want to trust you, it's the most direct route to discovering whether or not that person's trustworthy. Because if they're not going to own up and work on it, sometimes it's okay to say, then that relationship has got to be closed. But a lot of our problems are created because relationships to happen. Because simple slights, simple offenses. And we just go, no, there's that gap. The best way to turn somebody who's trustworthy into somebody who's not is to not trust them. You want to damage that relationship, I guarantee, faster than anything else you can do, would start not trusting them. And I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, Pastor Charity, what do you know about trust? Well, you know what? I was married for 12 years. And one day, 4 years ago, my husband stood up and said, I don't want this anymore. I don't want this family. I don't want to be here anymore. You want to talk about breaking trust? So there was a huge gap in what I considered relationships. And the who we are part of relationships, the what's happened to us before, we carry that with us everywhere we go. And when God brought Aaron into my life, I had to make a choice. What I was going to put in the gap of my new relationship with Aaron. Because I can tell you, I brought everything from before and tried to put it at his feet. To say, you weren't here on time. You're never going to be here on time. That's not true. You said this and you didn't follow through. I had to be willing to take and close one gap and make sure that I didn't create new gaps moving forward. So yeah, I understand a lot about trust. I understand about it being broken and saying there's a chasm a mile wide. There's no way that that can be fixed. I'm here to tell you God can fix it. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm going to divide this room into pretty much two groups of people. I want you to think right now, if you're the type of person who has a difficult time trusting people, like everyone, and you have good reason, there's been something in your past, your childhood, previous marriage, previous employer, you just in general have a hard time trusting people. I'm going to give you a step today to overcome that. And it's going to be a physical step. And it's going to be a big one. And this wasn't where I was going, and God said, this is where we're going. So we're going to go. Choir saying breaking your chains. Well, you know what? Breaking the chains of untrustworthiness, it's one of the hardest things you're ever going to do. Because our relationships and our past color how we deal with things in the future. So I'm going to break you up into 2 groups, and I got to change what I was doing because this is where God's saying we're going. So the first group here is you just don't trust people in general. You don't let anybody get too close. You don't want to build any kind of relationship. It's all surface. That's my first group of people. My second group of people, you're going to say, I'm a pretty trusting person. I'm like, I might even pick up a hitchhiker. I pretty much, I give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But, here's that word, but. There's one person. Might be a family member, might be an in-law, might be a coworker. That when, there's just something about them that's untrustworthy. They rub you the wrong way. You walk in and you're just like, they're looking at me funny again. Or you come in a room and you're like, shh, did you say that? Shh. Everybody's talking about me. What? There's a gap with that one person. God said always, so that doesn't leave any room for gaps. So you've got to think, what can I do to break the cycle of mistrust? And you're sitting there thinking, I don't have to do anything. They're the one causing all the problems. They did this, they did that, they. If they did this and this and this, then, well, I could, of course, I'd forgive and I'd do this. Folks, it just doesn't work that way. I'm sorry. God said, you know what? Put your big boy pants on and suck it up. That's what he asked you to do. He said always. And that's what you got to do. They don't have to do anything to act more trustworthy. Sometimes it's our job to step forward and say, what can I do? Because love believes all things, it endures all things, it hopes all things. It bends. Maybe it's a conversation. Maybe it's a little more confrontation than conversation. To get out the words, I want to trust you. And here's what it all comes down to. When there's a gap, Jesus told us what to do. It's really simple. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. When you create the gap, what do you want somebody else to do to you? We want them to assume the best. We want them to believe the best in us, right? So if I take the words of Paul and I take the words of Jesus and I threw them in a pot and I mixed them all up, and I threw it out over all of you, do you know what it would simply be? When there's a gap, you have to trust. You extend them not what they deserve. You extend them exactly what you'd want them to do to you. You give them the gift of trust. It'll fix your relationships. So this is what I want. If today you say, I'm in group 1, Pastor, I just don't trust. And you're ready today to say, I'm done. I want the chain to be broken. I want to close those gaps. I want you to stand up and come stand right here.